This is more like a World War I battlefield. Once you have networked, integrated all of the overhead surveillance, manned, unmanned, sensors from the ground all the way into space, with all of your strike systems, and the Russians historically have always had enormous numbers of strike systems. I'm talking about anything beyond line of sight. Once those are networked, you make it impossible for your enemy, unless the enemy has substantial air and missile defenses, to really move. It makes maneuver almost impossible. That's what the Russians have done in Ukraine. So hopefully, people will listen to President Trump and understand just how terrible the lethality of this battlefield is. But I don't think they will. I think this is going to go on and on and on until 20 January. And then the real question is, can he rein in this rogue deep state, which consists largely of the intelligence communities and their supporters, and especially on the Hill? Can he rein it in? If he can't rein it in, can he break it and make it responsive to national command authority? I don't know.
We have to assume, and I think it's a safe assumption, that behind the headlines and behind the public statements, that whether in the Pentagon or whether in Whitehall or in the halls of power in France, that they're aware of what's actually going on the ground. They can see things. They're aware of these. They know that whatever the real number of Ukraine losses are, they have to know all that. So they have to know, just no matter what they want to say or what they wish would happen, that there are constraints and limitations physically on the battlefield. And yet, here we have Keir Starmer just yesterday addressing the war in Ukraine, almost completely oblivious. It's not just his words, but his actions that go along with them.
Absolutely right to say it's a critical period for Ukraine. And I've been here with key NATO allies this morning having a discussion about Ukraine. We're on HMS Iron Duke here, which is in Estonia. We've got troops up the road who are integrated as part of our NATO response. The collective view is very clear. We must put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That means we've got to make sure they have the capability they need, the training they need, the funding that they need, and we must support Ukraine in what they're doing. This is an act of aggression by Russia that's been going on for a very, very long time, so we must stand with Ukraine at this critical period.
Are you comfortable with the assassination, though?
Well, as I say, we must stand with Ukraine. I think that's a developing situation, but this morning's discussion was very clear about the strategic need.
So he referenced there, he was asked about the assassination of the Russian general. We're going to get to that in just a second. Stick with that first part there, because he mentioned that he was at a NATO meeting where he's talking about this continuing on, and we have to keep going on. But everybody knows, even if you ignore the battlefield, that Donald Trump's coming in unequivocally and emphatically saying, as we just showed from yesterday, we're going to find a negotiated settlement. So then why would the NATO and Western countries continue with this fiction as though Joe Biden is going to continue to be president?
Well, the governments that we're discussing, like Keir Starmer's government or Olaf Scholz's government and Macron's government, are all in the hands of globalists that are committed to the open-ended, relentless war against Russia for all the reasons that we've discussed in the past. Russia presents an obstacle to the globalists that they can't get past. Russia is a national state. It has a culture that rests on the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. You begin to look at these things carefully, and clearly Russia has to be destroyed. Because what have all of these people done? Starmer is trying to destroy his own country. He's trying to accelerate immigration into the country, involving millions of people who are non-Europeans, with the goal of destroying his own population. We've seen this unfold in Ireland. It's unfolding in Germany, in France, to a lesser extent in Spain, and to some extent in Italy. These governments are not going to last. Right now, Meloni can survive. There's no question about that in Italy, because she's diverged sharply from that path. But everybody else in Berlin, Paris, and London, they're scheduled for extinction. They're not going to last, Dan, and they know that. So I wouldn't put too much store in what they are saying, but I think it's another reflection of just how powerful this unelected deep state is, and the fact that it reaches over national borders into countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain.
Okay, but let's accept that that they think that way, et cetera. But there's still the practical matter. And this is the part that I just don't understand. And you may want that outcome, but you know that somebody's about to come in that's going to change it diplomatically. And you see on the battlefield, it will not go the way you want. So where is the value in having the fiction to go up in for another month or so?
Well, if you're familiar with Noam Chomsky's manufactured consent, and you also are familiar with Leon Trotsky and his activity as a Bolshevik, Trotsky's quip to one of his Bolshevik lieutenants who said, "Comrade, we can't possibly say this. It's not true." And he looked at him and he said, "Comrade, paper will put up with anything you put on it." Well, we've learned that the radio, television, internet, all of these things will put up with whatever you put on it. And sadly, large numbers of people will believe it, particularly if you keep saying it over and over and over again. So, this is going to go on until it is unambiguously clear that everyone's being lied to. Things are not turning out as anticipated, and they will not continue. Now, I think that's already begun a little bit in Germany, although I think the new chancellor, this Christian Democrat, is making stupid statements about Russia. That's not going to go down well with the public, not because they love Russians, but because nobody there is interested in going to war with Russia. I saw a poll today in Poland that suggested 55% of the adult population wants nothing to do with the war against Russia. These things are facts, and at some point, facts are hard to avoid, and they're insurmountable. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to them. In this sense, President Trump is on the right side of history. I just hope that he doesn't have unrealistic expectations of what he can impose. Impose is important on so-called on the Russians or Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, because I don't think he can do that.
Okay, let's look at the other part of what Starmer said there. He was asked, and it was interesting as he was asked about the assassination of the Russian general, is that it apparently caught him off guard. I don't know how it would have. And he was like trying to figure out how he can say something without saying anything. And that's exactly what he said. Well, we'll have to figure that out later. Anyway, back to what I was saying here. But what do you make of this assassination attempt? Because this also fits in the pattern of nobody knows that the war can't be won more than the Ukrainian people behind the scenes and off camera. And yet they're not only have been trying to get this long range weapon systems used by the United States and France and Britain to hit targets in Russia. And then this most recent attempt at a provocation to assassinate somebody in Russia. And according to the Wall Street Journal this morning, that's supposed to send a message to Russia. That's supposed to make them quake that nobody is safe, etc. What do you make of the real intent behind this?
Well, we have to know a little bit more about General Kirillov, and I did not. And for the last 24 to 36 hours, I've been digging, and several of my sources have finally come forward and explained the rationale behind this assassination. At the start of the special military operation, General Kirillov was adamant that the various biolabs inside Ukraine that we had helped set up and finance be seized as soon as possible. Now, there were a total in Ukraine of 46 biolabs that the Russians eventually found. These biolabs were engaged in developing bioweapons. They were looking at DNA and genetics to try and formulate a weapon that could be used against Russia that would kill only Russians. Now, I don't know how far they got, because if you look at Ukrainian DNA, which is different from Russian DNA, it's not radically different, but there are differences. If you look at that and then you look at Russian DNA, I don't know how they would have managed to avoid killing large numbers of Ukrainians. But then again, given the acute lack of interest in humanity in Washington, it may not have mattered to the people that were behind this. But he was the first to say, we've got to get into those biolabs, find out what they were doing. And I'm only talking about one aspect of the horrific things being done in those laboratories, where they found body parts that had been removed and were going to be resold. And a number of experiments that I don't want to go into. But the point is, there were 46 of them. And ultimately, the Russians, once they found out what they hoped was not true, they then destroyed these. They've obviously held on to much of the evidence. And a lot of this evidence leads back on a trail all the way to Washington, D.C., and some key political figures who have a hand in this and have actually invested in it. It's pretty frightening. In addition, he also identified the Kharkov Institute, which was the one place in Ukraine that was capable of developing a nuclear weapon. Now, how much Ukrainians were able to rescue from Kharkov before it was overrun by the Russians, but the Russians did get into it. They did get to the Kharkov Institute, and they discovered that there were efforts underway to create a suitcase nuclear weapon. We've heard lots about this in the media. Apparently, that was actually underway. Kirillov was behind all of the discoveries. He was the one who was tracking closely with Russian intelligence what we and the Ukrainians were doing in Ukraine. The military ultimately went in, at first was skeptical, but then when they began to discover the accuracy of his assertions, they went into all of them. And they've eliminated the labs, and they have shut down this thing in Kharkov Institute. But when you understand that, then you can understand why this criminal Ukrainian state, this organized crime state we pretend is a democracy or some other nonsensical thing, wants to kill the man, because he revealed what they were up to. And that's something they didn't want anyone to discover.
And we've talked about that. I think just yesterday on our show, we showed the headline from online right now at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, I think they call it, where we admit there were 46 labs in the that the United States had funded. It's in. So this is not conspiracy theory kind of stuff. They, in fact, we still to this day admit, yeah, the stuff was there. And then they tried to shift it away and say, but, it was just a Russian propaganda misinformation campaign, because really everything was really cool. Now, there's out today an additional, or maybe it was yesterday, from the UK. Michael Clark went on Sky News to try and explain a different reason why Kirill may have been taken out.
Kirillov was in charge of CBN, chemical, biological, nuclear, by which we mean radiological. And he was in charge of the protection of Russian troops from those elements, chemical, biological, radiological. But his role went far beyond that. His actual behavior was that he was involved in the planning of chemical warfare in Syria. And he's had a great deal to do, and that's what the British government think, with chemical warfare all the way around the front in Ukraine. The K-51 gas grenade, a grenade that carries CS gas, but in some cases in lethal concentrations, is ubiquitous all along the front. It's used all the time. And there have been traces of sarin and cyanide in a number of chemical attacks. The Ukrainians have said that about 5,000 attacks have taken place. Western analysts say that might be a slight exaggeration, but the number is more or less credible.
It just seems a little bit unusual and skeptical when you're going to claim that there have been 5,000, there's that DTRA headline that Gary was showing yesterday, that there are 5,000 chemical weapon strikes used by Russia. We've never heard about it until after this assassination. What do you make of this charge?
Well, first of all, I think we've learned by now not to believe much that the Ukrainians say. I mean, we're back to the ghost of Kiev. And I think the Russians have been extraordinarily careful. Putin certainly has. I see no evidence for what they're arguing. Now, could someone have done something somewhere along the, 800-mile front? I have no idea. But I think that Ukrainian assertion is ridiculous. I think, on the other hand, what I've told you is quite true. And this is an old Bolshevik trick. If you are doing something that is horrific and heinous, accuse your opponent of doing it. And use that as the justification for what you're doing. That's an old Bolshevik approach. It's nothing new in any of that. So I would take this with a grain of salt and go back to the original assertion. Were there any biolabs being established along the border of Ukraine by Russians for use against Ukrainians? Answer, no. Well, then why would the Russians then suddenly turn to the use of chemical or biological weapons against Ukrainians? They haven't. And that's not the sort of thing that the Russians are going to do in proximity to their own territory.
Yeah.
But this is a mountain of lies that's being built, and the mountain has to be dismantled. It will be, but not quickly. Now, I also noticed something else. He talked about Syria, and you and I have exchanged comments on this. You know Ted Postel, and we know what a number of British observers have said, that MI6 staged 2 false flag events, both of which attracted missiles that were fired at Syria at President Trump's insistence. President Trump needs to understand that he hasn't had much truth from anybody in the intelligence community. He hasn't had much truth from anybody at the top of the Department of Defense. If he doesn't have truth tellers there, he's in a lot of trouble, because the people that are at the top of those organizations have a lot of people under them that are not telling them the truth. So we don't know what's going to happen after 20 January. I have always said, and I repeat this with all sincerity, Donald Trump is a man of good intentions and he is sincere, but he is frequently misinformed or simply lied to, boldface, lie. And that's a problem that exists now, and it's going to exist in the future. He's going to have to deal with that. And I hope that the people he's appointed are going to be able to tell him the truth.